thank you to the Family Action Network for hosting this wonderful event and all the events that you do host. It's such an important time to be talking about this topic of mass incarceration. And I'm delighted to be here to welcome Emily Bazelon to Evanston and to have this chance to talk with her and with all of you about a topic that has been called the civil rights issue of our time. The overwhelming rate of incarceration of predominantly young African American and Latino men. And to talk, most importantly, about the role of the people who make charging decisions on our behalf, the prosecutors. Emily's book is an examination of mass incarceration, its history, its causes, and its consequences. Most movingly, Charge tells the story of two young people caught up in the system, charged with serious offenses, and it tells the story of the prosecutors who have been tasked with charging them and prosecuting them. So thank you, Emily, for being here. What drew you to this project? Why write about mass incarceration?
Thank you. I'm going to answer that. I just want to start by saying thank you so much to Lonnie and to everyone who works at FAN. This is a really special organization. As an author, and I'm sure I speak for other authors, I wish there were organizations like this in many cities. You guys are so lucky. And thank you all so much for coming. There are many demands on your time, and I really appreciate your being here. I started thinking about this topic several years ago when I was working on other stories in which prosecutors and the discretion that they exercise just played a really unexpected role. I wrote a story about the 3 strikes law in California several years ago. There was a ballot initiative that was going to reform this very harsh sentencing law. And the conservative Republican district attorney in Los Angeles at the time, whose name was Steve Cooley, was supporting this reform. And so I thought that was sort of surprising. And I called and asked him why. And he told me a story about a man named Gregory Taylor, who was homeless and unscrewed the screws on a screen door to a food pantry at 5 in the morning because it was closed and he was hungry. So this case didn't come to Steve Cooley back when he was a regular prosecutor. It landed on the desk of one of his colleagues. And that prosecutor charged this offense as a 3rd strike. And Gregory Taylor went to prison for the rest of his life. And when Steve told me the story, he was explaining why he wanted to support reform. But I heard the story and thought, like, wait a second. The fact that this case file went to one assistant DA instead of another had this huge effect on this one human being. Like, how does that happen? And I never thought about that before. And then I think once you see the power of prosecutors, you can kind of trace it throughout the system. And there's some academic research we can talk about that kind of explains and shows how important their role is. But for me, it always starts with these like very individual narratives of seeing human beings caught in a vice and then wondering where that power comes from and who's exercising it. Is it really the right person in the system who has all this decision-making power?
Well, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You describe, the criminal system as having this net widening effect, social control. Why should the average person care about our criminal justice system?
Well, I think there are a few answers to that. I mean, one very practical answer is that this is a system that is involving millions of people. So many people that, even more affluent folks are finding more and more that they know someone who's personally caught up in it. To give you a couple of numbers, there are 2.2 million people in jail or prison in the United States. That's 5 times the number in the 1970s. So we've seen this enormous spike in incarceration. And there are another close to 5 million people who are being supervised, meaning usually they're on parole or probation, in a way that they're subject to a lot of pretty technical conditions like curfews and not being able to go out with certain people or to certain places, and they often end up cycling back into jail. So we're just talking about this very big net. And, you know, even if that doesn't affect your life personally, we are spending so much money on locking all these people up as a matter of resources, in terms of limits on what we can spend on other places like schools, all kinds of other services. This really has become a drag on taxpayer dollars. And so I think just from a sort of point of view of fiscal responsibility, it's important to think about.
Emily, you mentioned the prosecutorial discretion and prosecutorial power. Can you talk a little bit about the history of prosecutorial power? I mean, you mentioned some academic research. You go into it a little in your book. Will you just expand on that a little bit here?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, the classic image of the American criminal justice system is a judge at the top of a triangle. That's like our neutral referee, the person we expect to be impartial. And then we're supposed to have the defense lawyer and the prosecutor at the bottom of this triangle, and they're supposed to have equal bargaining power. Starting in the late 70s, in part as a response to a rising crime, we jacked up sentencing laws in this country. We raised penalties, and we didn't just do that. We also took away discretion from judges by introducing lots of mandatory minimum sentences. So by the mid-90s, every state in the country has at least one mandatory minimum, and often multiple sentences work in this way. We talked about it at the time as a way of getting tough, and we elected a lot of district attorneys who were using mandatory minimums in that way. What we didn't explicitly surface is that a mandatory minimum sentence bakes the punishment into the charging decision. And charging is up to prosecutors. They often have a menu of options, because another thing that happened beginning in the 80s is we started to expand our criminal codes. And so prosecutors were in a position of being able to stack up charges and impose these potential mandatory prison sentences on people. It all made the wheels of the system turn fast, because what happens when you're facing a really heavy penalty is you're much more likely to plead guilty. But it also meant many, many total years of incarceration. And one of the statistics in the academic literature from a law professor at Fordham named John Pfaff, he saw that in this period where we see incarceration spike in the 90s and early 2000s, the percentage of cases that were charged as felonies as opposed to misdemeanors by prosecutors doubles from about 1/3 of the total to 2/3. And so what you're seeing there is one piece of research really isolate the role of prosecutors and then show this tie between that shift that prosecutors were making and this real escalation of incarceration.
Would the system be better if we gave discretion back to judges?
I think that it would be. I don't think that's the only thing we have to do, but, you know, look, judges have their own challenges, and especially in states where judges are elected, they often are imperfect actors too, because they get very responsive to politics, and if a high-profile case goes wrong, like God forbid they let someone out, give someone a break, and then that person harms someone else, they often feel on the hook. Even with all of those caveats, judges are still the people who are supposed to be impartial. And I think to hand all this discretion from an impartial figure to someone whose primary responsibility is to win convictions, it has a kind of warping effect on the whole system. Now, I want to say that does not, I don't mean to suggest that I think prosecutors operate in bad faith. They are people who've gone into public service with the intention of making the world a better place. Most of them have high ethical standards, and they do have an obligation to be a minister of justice. But the drive to win convictions is really strong, and so I think to give so much power to people where that is an integral part of their role is just sort of a system error.
You talk about that a little bit in your book. You call it conviction psychology. What is that? What is conviction psychology?
Yeah, so this is a phenomenon that people started to name and talk about in the 1970s. This idea that when you are a prosecutor, what you benefit from, what rewards you in your work, what often gets you promoted is winning convictions. And so at the outset, when you make a charging decision, you've already taken a step that gives you an interest in this case ending with what feels like a victory. namely conviction. And so this is tied to this problem of kind of tunnel vision that prosecutors sometimes have problems with. And we see this especially with wrongful convictions, where in the beginning, when you charge someone, maybe you're not sure, maybe there's some evidence that could point in a different direction. But once you've made that decision, it's hard to go back on it. People don't like to admit they make mistakes. And so if other evidence comes in and it doesn't actually match the decision, the call you made at the outset, you may not weigh it as heavily. You may be looking for that evidence that fits what's called your confirmation bias, the sort of pre-existing, at this point, notion that you have about how to sift the information that's coming in before you.
Talk about wrongful conviction. So let's switch over and talk about these two people you follow in your book, Nora and Kevin. These two young people are charged with very serious offenses. Nora, the murder of her mother, and Kevin charged with a gun crime, a crime of violence. Nora may well be innocent. So what happened there? What led you to their stories? Were you looking for stories like that?
Yeah, so Nora's case, Nora was in prison when I met her in 2015. It actually took her a long time to decide to talk to me and to want to trust a journalist. I actually started by being interested in the prosecutor who charged her. So that prosecutor's name is Amy Wyrick. She was a trial prosecutor in Memphis, and then she became the elected district attorney in Memphis after Nora's conviction. And I was interested in her and her office because they had a pattern there of misconduct and of violating the constitutional rights of defendants. And this project at Harvard has identified them as one of the 5 offices in the country with the worst records in this regard. And I was just curious about how that happens. Like, how do you have prosecutors repeatedly violate people's rights and just like go on their merry way? It kind of seemed like Amy Wyrick had, in Nora's case, Nora was convicted of this murder. And then I have to tell you this part because I can't like leave her hanging out there. And then her conviction was reversed by the Tennessee Supreme Court because of prosecutorial misconduct. But then Amy Wyrick got elected to be the DA. And so I was interested in looking at that phenomenon. And Nora's case, because it had all these very dramatic facts, was a really good vehicle for that once I got her to talk to me. And to just give you a little more context for that case, so Nora's mother was brutally stabbed to death in the middle of the night. The kind of crime that there's a lot of pressure to solve. This was like a nice white lady in a suburban or like nice neighborhood in Memphis. And there was a lot of DNA at the scene. It went away to the crime lab and took months to reappear. And in the meantime, there weren't any other suspects. The cops didn't have any leads. And suspicion started to settle on Nora. She'd been out all night the night her mother was killed. And there were a couple hours in the middle of the night that were unaccounted for. So Amy Wyrick charged Nora with this murder, and then the evidence came back from the crime lab, and the DNA excluded Nora from the scene.
Right, that's what's crazy about the story.
Well, and this is sort of related to this issue of tunnel vision that I was talking about before, because it didn't change any aspect of the case, even though the DNA also pointed to 2 still unknown suspects whose DNA was there at the crime scene. And so that sort of begins to unspool this case that ends up with Nora being in prison and convicted, and I think, yes, does raise some questions about her guilt and innocence. And so that case had this story in it I was fascinated by, and then a way of exploring this problem of abuse of power. The story that I write about in Brooklyn with Kevin is, to me, very different. Kevin's not innocent. He had a gun. He got caught with it. His story of why he had that gun is, to me, pretty sympathetic. He was in a friend's apartment. The cops were at the door. He knew his friend had a serious criminal record, was going to go away for a long time if he got nailed for that gun. And so in a kind of rash, very 19-year-old moment, Kevin picked up the gun. He had the crazy idea of flushing it down the toilet, which suggests that, he wasn't thinking super straight. That didn't work. And he got arrested and charged for gun possession, which in New York carries a mandatory minimum 3.5-year prison sentence in a case like this. However, in Brooklyn, the only part of New York, there's a kind of escape hatch for young people. If you can show that you are a good prospect, there's a diversion program that's actually a social work effort run right out of the DA's office. And Kevin, a few months after I met him, was admitted to this program. So I got to watch in real time as he went through this. It took about a year and a half to complete the program. Was he going to make it? I very much on purpose picked someone who I think a lot of people might see as like scary. This young black kid caught with a gun in a poor neighborhood who was struggling to get through this program properly. And I wanted to challenge you, my readers, to kind of think about these crimes that we classify as serious and violent, and to think about this idea of zero tolerance, of kind of blanket mandatory prison sentences for everyone. And I honestly really wanted to understand why Kevin and his friend had this gun in the first place. Like, why do people have illegal weapons? So that was what drew me to that case. And I guess I should say one more thing about Brooklyn, which is that this diversion program existed because the district attorney in Brooklyn came in as a progressive and was trying to reduce mass incarceration and was very committed to this program, even though the cops in New York were trying to shut it down, with the help, I should add, of Mayor de Blasio.
Well, I have a lot of questions to follow up on that. The story of Kevin is one, and same with Nora. You do a masterful job of really providing mitigation. That is going
a lawyer's word.
Yeah. Going in depth and explaining the complexities of their lives. And not necessarily excusing the behavior, but explaining the complexities of their lives. In my experience representing clients, there are some who are simply not as sympathetic, who are charged and guilty of serious offenses, of murders, of assaults. Does the progressive prosecutor movement expand to include those folks? The Octavias, for instance.
Yeah, Octavia is this person, I shouldn't say character, a woman in prison with Nora who was participated in a terrible stabbing, like a home invasion, with the guy she was seeing at the time. He was looking for money to buy drugs, and she went along with him and received astronomically long sentence. She's going to be in prison for the rest of her life unless something else happens to spare her. And so what I would say about that is, I'm not a prison abolitionist because it's hard for me to imagine a world in which we don't separate people who've committed truly violent acts for some amount of time. But I think the huge challenge in these cases is to think about proportional punishment, and also the question of what it takes to deter crime and what we're doing purely out of revenge and kind of fear of letting people go. I think we've become a society where we just expect very long sentences for people who commit violent crimes. And we're not that interested in the fact that really the research shows that almost everybody by their late 30s ages out of committing crimes. Even people who kill someone are very unlikely to do something like that again once they've been locked up for years and they're no longer young. And so to me, all of that should matter. If you have people who are willing to think remorsefully and really reckon with the harm they've caused, and who could get out and have some kind of a life back and be reunited with their families, sometimes with their children, I feel like we don't weigh that part of the equation enough. That it's not a matter of, opening the doors and willy-nilly letting everyone go. It's more thinking about all of the money and energy and resources we're putting into confining people who don't necessarily, for our safety, need to be confined and who are still human beings.
Yeah, I always try to think of mercy. Can we exercise mercy in our criminal system? And is that a necessary component to ending mass incarceration? Are progressive prosecutors thinking along the lines of proportionality?
I think they are. I think that mercy is a word some of them are uncomfortable with, not because they don't want to do it, because it sounds like mushy or soft, right? And so one thing I hear people talk about instead is second chances, and the idea that once you paid a debt, you should be able to go on with your life. I also am drawn to the concept of mercy, and I used it quite a lot in my book. And then when people were reading the book before it was published, I was asking for feedback. I got like some interesting responses to that word. To me, it seems like a word that kind of comes out of morality and religion and goes along with compassion. But I think it's really important to progressive prosecutors to be seen and to truly be primarily concerned still with public safety. Like, that's their job, and we all deserve to be safe. And I don't think that we can succeed really in shrinking the system if people feel like they're not safe. Those things have to go together, and I think, in fact, that they can.
What makes a prosecutor progressive?
That is a great question. I think you have to have a basic commitment to shrinking the whole system down. That can mean declining charges. It could mean shorter sentences for people, more alternatives, thinking of mental illness and drug abuse as problems that the criminal justice system is really not like the right net to catch all those people in. In some cities, it means not prosecuting people for skipping a subway or a train fare anymore. And I think it has to also start to encompass these problems of all the people we've locked up, the hundreds of thousands of people are being locked up for decades under previous administrations. Even though you didn't put those folks away, they're still in some way should be on your mind and making some effort to address. And, you know, in some ways, the most important thing that progressive prosecutors can do is band together and become a voice for an alternate way of thinking about public safety. So every state has a state DA's association, and they almost always lobby for harsher penalties every time. It just makes their job easier. So if the progressive DAs can then come along and as prosecutors say, wait a second, you know, we don't want to be locking people up forever. We can think of better ways outside of law enforcement to be trying to prevent crime. That is really important.
Let me shift a little bit and talk about race and class disparities in the system. We can't talk about mass incarceration without talking about race and class. We take students to court, and they are shocked time and again by what they see in our justice system. In your research for this book and throughout the book, you talk about some of these disparities. You talk specifically about the probation system and the race disparities in the probation system. You talk about this moment where Eric Gonzalez discovers the disparity in the charging of marijuana crimes.
This is in Brooklyn. He's the DA in Brooklyn.
He's the DA in Brooklyn. Can you talk a little bit about some of the concrete examples you discovered in researching this book about those disparities and what prosecutors are doing?
Yeah, so I wish this wasn't such an easy question to answer, but basically at every stage of the criminal justice system, you see racial disparity. You see Black people punished more harshly for the same conduct as white people. One example is that Black people and white people, people of different colors and ethnicities, use drugs at the same rate in this country, but the arrest and conviction rate is much higher for Black and brown people. And you see the same thing with guns. You see higher rates of gun ownership among white people, but African Americans much more likely to be charged with an offense for a gun. So, you know, when you see a problem like that riddled through the whole system, you should ask some questions too about socioeconomic factors. But really what you're talking about is, I think, a kind of willingness of society to look the other way. And this feeling that like some people's lives don't matter in the same way as other people. When I started doing my reporting about Kevin in Brooklyn, one of the social workers who was working with the kids I was interested in said to me, you know, these are throwaway kids. And she wasn't talking about her own feelings. She was just talking about like the message she got from the world about the work she was doing and why it wasn't of very much value. And that just kind of like killed me, that she would feel that way, would transmit that to me, and just the sense that there are some people who are worth discarding. And you know, I think because I am the mother of 2 teenage boys, it just constantly occurred to me that my kids would be treated differently in so many different situations. I think this question of who gets second and third chances is just this enormous one in our society, like who gets the benefit of the doubt. And if you give a message to kids that like they don't deserve the benefit of the doubt, that they're suspect in these multiple ways, that has a deep effect on them. I mean, what we really need are places, I hope like this one, where you have a school that is, without even talking about it, preventing crime, because it's giving kids a better sense of who they are and who they can be.
I think one of the other things that surprises me is when I go to state courts, it seems like a non-public public place.
Yes.
People don't really come to observe, and it's private and dark and not a place where there is a lot of light. What about transparency in the system? Is it important? How do we make that happen? How do we open up these courts?
Yeah, I mean, I often feel when I go to court that if everyone could see what I was seeing, it wouldn't be happening, because like we wouldn't think it was okay. And that really the most important thing I do is just like bear witness and kind of translate. And a lot of courts, it's hard to understand what's going on. There's like bad acoustics and a lot of jargon and just very quick sets of procedures happening, and you just like literally can't follow. So one, I think, really important development in this area are court watch groups, and I think you guys have one here in Chicago. They train people to just sit in court and observe and to write up things they see that seem like a problem. So in New York, for example, often court watch folks sit in arraignment. And then when they see someone where really high bail is being set for like stealing something from Rite Aid, some very minor offense, and someone's going to jail, they put it on social media. And at first I was seeing these things and I thought, like, is anyone going to pay attention? But you know what? I was hanging out a lot in the Brooklyn DA's office, and they did care about this. They did not like this criticism they were seeing out there. Because you know what? It turns out if you steal a loaf of bread and you're going to jail because you can't pay like $30,000 bond, people think that's kind of crazy. And I think the most important thing that these organizations bring is this kind of sunlight and transparency. And they're also a kind of countervailing force to the story of the guy who got a break on a drug offense and went out and hurt someone. Like, that's the headline in the newspaper. If that's the only kind of crime story we're reading and seeing, then we never have to reckon with the cost of over-punishment. And I think that that kind of transparency is really helpful for evening out that equation.
I agree. So we've talked about,
good. You don't agree.
Yes, that's right. We've talked about the sort of the prosecutorial power a little bit. There's this other thread that runs through your book, and that is the new reform movement. When did this start? How did this happen? How is it that folks got together and said, we're going to do this, we're going to change who's sitting in our prosecutors' chairs?
Yeah, so this was a really lucky, I mean, it's, I hope good for the world, but it was also, frankly, good for me as an author. I started working on this book, and then in 2016, in this election cycle, for the first time across the country, in more than like one or two places, a whole bunch of people ran for DA in big cities, or state's attorney is the word you guys use here, in big cities, and they ran on this progressive platform of reducing mass incarceration. And I think this came out of a few different kind of forces coming together. So one really important part of this is the Black Lives Matter movement. People have been protesting. They had been wanting DAs and state's attorneys to indict police officers who are involved in the shootings of unarmed people. But then they also realized those same people were responsible for locking up way too many people in their communities. And so you see, and I think a pretty exciting way, these local groups feeling like they're going to take back this office. Then there are fiscal conservatives who are concerned about all the money they think is getting misspent. And this is true in places like Texas and Denver and North Carolina, not places you think of as like liberal bastions. And those people also started saying like, wait a second, something's wrong here. We need to rethink this. And then finally, you see some big donors like George Soros kind of notice this phenomenon and think like, okay, if I invested some money here, I could really like help this movement take off. And all those forces came together, and the election in November 2016 was kind of a big deal for many reasons that you all may remember. But I woke up the next morning and I noticed that a dozen of these prosecutors had been elected all across the country, including here. You all, Chicago, Cook County elected Kim Foxx. And this is, you know, a beginning movement, and we can talk about some of the challenges these people have faced. It's not like, an immediate panacea, but it is a sea change from what we have had for many decades, which is an assumption that you run for DA by being tough as nails, you're going to lock everybody up, and you keep winning over and over again. Kind of no matter what you do, the incumbent always wins. So for the reasons, merely a kind of democracy reason, I think it's really healthy that we're seeing these kinds of challenges.
Well, let's talk about some of the challenges these people face by talking about Kim Foxx.
Okay.
Kim Foxx ran on a message of reform. Her story, her background, it's so compelling. And she's obviously facing a lot of backlash right now for her office's use of discretion in the Smollett case. Are prosecutors, no matter how progressive, constrained necessarily by the police and the line attorneys and the judges surrounding them? What's a prosecutor to do in that instance?
Yeah, so, I mean, when you come in and you have a different person at the top, that's really important. You're not going to change without that. But it doesn't mean that the whole system is necessarily going to change all at once. You have all these prosecutors who have been working under a different set of assumptions for a long time. And it takes a while for offices to transition. And then it turns out that while this criminal justice system was very happy to give prosecutors a lot of power when they were using it to lock people up, if you start declining to prosecute people, it turns out the police and often judges are not so excited about this anymore, and they are invested in the status quo. There are a lot of very powerful forces in the bureaucracy, sometimes involving for-profit organizations in, bail agencies or probation or sometimes for-profit prisons. And all of these forces can get in your way. Now, all that said, I had some questions myself about the Jussie Smollett case. I don't mean to suggest that that was totally from beginning to end flawless. I was confused by Fox's decision to kind of partially recuse herself and then seem to not have done that. But I do think this general question of mercy and whether it makes sense to be prosecuting people to the hilt for nonviolent crimes, that seemed connected to that case. And I think that it also seemed in this city and in other cities that the police seem to be looking for these progressive DAs to fail and for reasons to doubt them. And, I also have to say, one of the exciting things about these new DAs getting elected is they're not all white men. If you look at the prosecutors across the country right now, white men are very much overrepresented among the total 2,400 people. And this group of people has people of color in it, it has women, and some of those people, especially the women of color, have really had a hard time kind of being given the same kind of respect that we normally see for public officials. So I think I see some of that in the response to Kim Foxx.
What about, can you talk a little bit about the different strategies employed by some of these progressive prosecutors? You talk about it in the book. You've got Eric Gonzalez and you have Larry Krasner. Very different strategies, right?
Yeah.
One is, you describe one as a barn burner, the other as a bridge builder.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
like that.
What's the better, does one have a better outcome than the other?
Well, it's kind of early days for both of them, so I still don't have to pick my favorite, really.
Yeah.
But they are different. So Eric Gonzalez is a career prosecutor. It's the only job he's ever had. He also grew up in a poor neighborhood, on the streets of Brooklyn. He's the first Puerto Rican DA in the city of New York. And so when he came into power, it was kind of an accident. It was because the former elected DA actually sadly died in office. And, Eric Gonzalez is this figure. He is able to say to the prosecutors in his office, I know how terrible it feels to think that we were causing harm instead of doing good. I know that we meant to help the community, but now I look back on some of the people I put in prison and I don't think they needed to be there. And and they all are coming back to the community, and I don't think we made them better equipped to be good citizens. So I want us to rethink how we're doing the job. It's easier to convey that message effectively to your troops, so to speak, if you were one of them and they can feel that. So I think that's an advantage that Eric Gonzalez has. I think one thing about being a total outsider like Larry Krasner, who had spent his career, he sued the Philadelphia Police Department 75 times before he was elected district attorney. It's not like the normal resume building thing that you do. And he just doesn't, he has like this deep feeling of like, I am an outsider. I do not care if anybody likes me. I'm not expecting to get along with all of you. And I'm accountable to this other constituency of like mostly low-income people of color. Like those are the people who knocked on doors for me. Those are the people who came out on election day, and I want to change the city that has a deeply racist and troubled history of policing. I mean, I know you guys have your problems, but I grew up in Philadelphia. So does Philadelphia. And so I think that that's the kind of strength he brings. Really, in all of these cities, what you're trying to do is rebuild trust between communities affected by crime and law enforcement. Because in a lot of these cities, and I know this is true here, the rate of solving homicides and non-fatal shootings is very low because people don't trust the police. They don't want to come forward. They don't want to be witnesses. And so when we're talking about public safety, if we can't promise swift and certain punishment for people who cause terrible harm, well, then it's hard to argue that you really are being tough on crime, even though we use those words kind of reflexively. So I think that's the big challenge for these folks, to show that the kind of approach they're taking is good for public safety, and it's also better for the health and well-being of communities.
Yeah, I mean, here our homicide solve rate is around 18%.
Yes, you, I think, are like the lowest of the big cities in the country, sadly.
We may be, yeah. So let's shift a little bit, because the people that impacts are the victims and the communities. And you have written that the greatest challenge facing prosecutors are the victims. How do victims fit into this reform movement? I mean, right, that's a particularly tough thing, particularly, when you're facing a victim who suffered from an assault or a like crime.
Yes, but I didn't mean to suggest that I thought victims were adversarial to reform prosecutors. I think victims should be at the center of all the reforms that we talk about, because their experiences should matter deeply. And one, real concern about victims, in every survey I've ever seen, they express dissatisfaction with the criminal justice system. They feel ignored and often mistreated and shunted aside. And yes, sometimes retribution and prison is what they are seeking, but it's not necessarily the only option that they want or are going to find beneficial in the longer run. And so I actually think this is just this giant missed opportunity, that if we could afford victims more opportunities for what's called restorative justice, broadly speaking, times where you can actually see that the person who's committed harm is reckoning with what they did wrong, that there's some form of restitution, whether it's monetary or in some other form, that might give you some sense of moral satisfaction, as well as the relief that can come with knowing that someone is gone from society for some amount of time. And again, everybody's going to come back out. So one of the efforts that I watched a little bit in Brooklyn is a restorative justice program for violent felons, which is really unusual. It's called Common Justice. And Danielle Sered, who runs that program and has a really good book out, which you should go read, the one thing she talks about is like, she doesn't let folks in unless the victims of the crimes they committed agree. And she goes and talks to families, and often, people whose kids have been assaulted or robbed or even attempted murder, she'll take those cases. And moms will say to her, like, I wanted this person basically to rot in hell. And then I thought about it, and it's like, what is going to make someone else's kid less likely to get hurt? It's going to be working with this person to try to see if there's a way to help them turn things around and really grapple with the harm that they've caused. So in the end, about 90% of the survivors of crime that Danielle interviews agree to participate in this program. And that just suggests to me that, like, there is a kind of deep yearning for this kind of effort, and yet we have very little of it. We sort of treat restorative justice as this like little embroidery, fringy thing around the edges, as opposed to something that should really be integral to the system.
Yeah, you talk about this great moment in your book, the Farah case, the restorative justice case. I mean, those are the kinds of cases we should be using transformative justice principles on. It was a
Yeah, and that case it's in Jacksonville, Florida, like a place with a lot of poor people, but a place where the electoral district is full of conservative Republicans. And they elected this new prosecutor named Melissa Nelson, and she came into a death penalty case and convinced the victims that the person who'd murdered their father, there's two FARA cases, weirdly. She does this restorative justice effort with both of them. So one of them, the murderer of the father of this family, had been missing for years and years. They finally find him, and it would be actually quite hard to prosecute him because it's like a really cold case. And so Melissa Nelson says to this family, like, well, would you like to talk to him? Like, I don't want to take a plea deal without making it feel like something that you are okay with, but what do you think of meeting with him? And she doesn't think they'll say yes. And then they all sit down together, and it actually provides a kind of sense of resolution, and it allows them to make peace with this outcome. So anyway, I do think there's just a lot of untapped potential there.
Really incredible. Two more questions. How do you measure progress in the state's attorney's office or district attorney's office?
Well, so I think we can't hold prosecutors solely accountable for the crime rate, but we are not really going to keep this window for reform open if crime rises. So I do think that, it's fair in general to hold politicians this question of, like, are you keeping us safe from violent crime? And then I think at the same time, we should be looking at the incarceration rate. Like, are you reducing the astronomical number of people and of years in jail and prison? What are you doing about cash bail, which we haven't talked about yet, but which puts people into jail when they haven't been convicted of anything? Is that really a tool that your office needs to use? And perhaps most of all, what alternatives are you creating? Because we can ask these folks to decline to prosecute, marijuana possession and fare beating, but there are going to be other offenses that, yes, we want them to go through the criminal justice system, but we don't necessarily need prison to be the consequence. So there have to be other possibilities. And I think one real challenge for progressive prosecutors anywhere is whether they really have enough other programs that work, that are effective and fair and treat people well, to really be able to offer some alternative.
I think one of the things that I enjoyed most is that you provide a series of reforms, a 21-part plan in your book. This book is hopeful, and that's a rare thing in the criminal justice field. This book is hopeful. What are 2 to 3 of the most significant reforms in your mind that you think are game changers?
Well, one of the principles that I offer at the end of this book, and I'm sure I didn't coin this phrase, is to treat kids like kids. So many people who commit crimes are what we've called juveniles for a long time, a kind of alienating word, I think, in itself. But, the notion of trying people who are still children, legally speaking, as adults has really become a bigger and bigger part of our criminal justice system. And it just causes really destructive consequences in these kids' lives. So I think that is in itself a really important principle. And it also goes with this sort of larger point, which I just want to hit a little bit more, which is that a lot of the most important and effective solutions to crime lie outside of law enforcement. So we look to the cops, we look to the courts, but the truth is there's a lot of really good research that one of the things that makes a difference in communities is the social cohesion, like the way in which neighbors look out for each other, the density of social services, nonprofit organizations, the health of the schools, this feeling that everybody wants to live in a community maybe like this one, where people have a kind of sense of well-being and they're in a decent physical environment, and there's this feeling that like everybody has a stake in kind of keeping it nice and holding it together and making sure that their neighbors are okay. And I think especially in poor communities, you need more social service organizations, a kind of bigger presence to really help knit that fabric together. And that is an investment that we can make, and that prosecutors prosecutors can support that can kind of try to address crime on the front end before it's even like a gleam in some teenager's eye.